be here with you. And I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen okay. Is that coming through? Yep, fantastic. So I too am coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Naarm and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I want to kind of begin this conversation today around talking about where we have come from in preventing child sexual abuse. And I also want to acknowledge that these slides are ones that I developed first for a presentation a few weeks ago at Kids First conference. So apologies if anybody was already in attendance at that. But I also gave a really early version of this much earlier in the year to a meeting that the National Office of Child Safety organised with a whole heap of youth-serving organisations. So part of their leadership group of that work. So one of the things that we've seen is a number of different shifts in time in our approach to understanding what child sexual abuse looks like and what our approach to prevention is. And here I've just highlighted a few of them that I'll kind of cover off on most of them at different times throughout the presentation. But just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that have shifted. Firstly, moving away from just thinking about stranger danger, in other words, the harm coming from someone that we don't know, to actually abuse within a familial context. Then a subsequent shift from thinking just narrowly about familial abuse to other known adults. Then thinking not just about perpetrators who are adults, but also about other children and young people with harmful sexual behaviour. We've also seen shifts around not just the outcome of harm to children in terms of an act of sexual abuse, but what enables that to occur. So the actions that kind of lead up to that. And that's got our focus around the actions of predators to groom children and, importantly, organisations and the broader community. We've also seen shifts away from focusing narrowly on child sexual abuse, sometimes you'll see the acronym CSA, to looking more broadly at where child sexual abuse fits within the context of other forms of child maltreatment. We've also seen a shift away from what we call tertiary responses. In other words, the role of either statutory child protection authorities or of criminal justice systems to restore safety and deal with the long-term harms, if you like, that can be the consequence of sexual abuse, to actually thinking from a prevention perspective, what does stopping harm from occurring in the first place look like? Which has then lifted our eyes onto not just the actions of predators, but also to the broader context in terms of our knowledge and our skills around making environments safer. Part of that is the knowledge and skills that young people have. So prevention education, including body safety, knowledge around respect and consent, but also about making situations safer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call contextual prevention. So that focus beyond the narrow problem of looking at, pardon me, at perpetrators or at victims. And across all those things, I summarise some of the shifts that we've seen using these three Ps, focusing on people, places and processes. And one of the reasons why we've seen some of these shifts in our approach to prevention is because, in fact, research on child sexual abuse has evolved over the past 30 to 50 years. I'm going to focus in particular in the last 30 years. And the reason for my focus on that is because of my own personal involvement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my research journey. But to kind of kick us off, to give a sense of the scope of the change in the research, I did a very quick analysis using a database of peer review journal articles. So, of course, there's other things, there's books, there's reports that are not going to be captured in here. But in terms of peer-reviewed articles, using the phrase child sexual abuse, so I didn't use sexual victimization, I didn't use any other terms, but using just sexual abuse, what we found was in 1980, there were 27 articles, a grand total of 27. By 1990, that had grown to nearly 1,500. 10 years later, it had grown to over 7,000. And you can see the exponential growth to, but the end of this year, 2024, so it's almost 2025, we can see over 40,000 articles. So the volume of research that has been generated in this past, 30 and 40 years has massively increased. Obviously, that's great news. It's also some challenges for people like me who need to be on top of the research. We have to use a lot more kind of searching and systematic reviews in order to make sense of what are the data telling us to be able to say where we're at. And it's also important for there to be knowledge translation. And that's why I'm really delighted to be here talking today at this Safeguarding Matters education session, because we need to be able to ensure that the wisdom within those 40,000 articles isn't just locked away behind a paywall available only for university researchers, but we need to make sure some of it is getting out there to people like you who are on the front line working in prevention and response and recovery from the harms of child sexual abuse. So one of the really influential researchers in this space is David Finkelhor, and his really seminal work entitled Child Sexually Victimized Children was published at the end of the 1970s. It was really groundbreaking. It was one of the largest surveys in the US that looked at the prevalence of victimization, the sources of different types of trauma, the differences between reported and unreported cases of assault, and led him to conclude that there's possibly a trend of increases in sexual victimization. He subsequently kept on conducting research of this nature and is now showing the opposite, that in fact we're seeing some declines, which is some great news. But as I said, this is a very personal journey for me, so please indulge me a little bit as I share where my journey began in this. So as I said, I gave a version of this presentation at the Kids First conference in Melbourne last month. And in fact, it was at the same organisation's conference. They were part of the organising group that ran the first national conference on child sexual abuse in 1994. And fresh out of honours year, so I just enrolled in my PhD, this was the very first conference presentation I ever gave. And then 30 years later, to the year, I was invited back as a keynote speaker to their subsequent conference. So that was, a great pleasure. And you can see there the title of my presentation on the screen. And of course, I, like the field, have grown and changed since that first presentation. I've given 390 other presentations and have, I said 120, I think by today it's about 125 publications. Not all of it on child sexual abuse, but much of it on child maltreatment more generally. So the thing that got me started off on this was some research that I did for, as I said, my honours year in psychology. And what I was looking at was the relationship between child sexual abuse and family violence. And the reason for looking at it was the kind of understanding that researchers had at that time was, firstly, that there was a lot of individual studies that were showing the relationship between child sexual abuse and depression, and another study looking at child sexual abuse and anxiety and PTSD. And, you could just about name any psychological disorder, and there was a growing body of research showing a strong relationship between, those two things. What then was starting to be questioned by researchers is what else is going on in these family environments? And are there other things? So people were using the language of family dysfunction. Is the family environments that children who experience child sexual abuse growing up in partly or even solely responsible for some of the outcomes that we see when we look at these simple correlations or relationships between child sexual abuse and an adult mental health outcome? So I took all of that research and tried to test this out. So I used a sample of university students, so female undergraduate, first year psychology students, which of course, if any of you know much about psychology undergraduate training, every honours year, that's pretty much where you get a lot of your participants from when you're doing your first independent piece of research. And also, as a first and second year student, you get used to participating in research. So you can kind of see it from both sides. So I did what was very typical, did a survey. And what I found was that, firstly, the rate of sexual abuse that was reported by these students was 23.6%, which you'll see in a moment when I present some of the data from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, is not wildly out of keeping with what we have subsequently found using nationally representative data. So this wasn't nationally representative. It was a self-selected sample of fairly well-adjusted people, who've already got to the stage of, being in tertiary education. But what was important was I'd asked a number of questions around family background, including some specific questions about the level of family violence and the co-presence of physical abuse as well. And so what happened was, once we'd taken into account those other forms of family violence and abuse, the relationship between child sexual abuse and the adult outcomes of well-being declined. So it did show that, at least in a well-adjusted group of tertiary educated young women, that there were other things going on in their lives that were explaining the levels of depression, anxiety, PTSD, sexual problems, etc. So that got me thinking about, what do we need to do to understand, firstly, the interrelationships between these different forms of harm and how they can have long-term consequences for people. So that was a rather long introduction to my journey in this space. So now, flip forward 25 years to when I was invited to join as a chief investigator the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. We put together a grant application to the National Health and Medical Research Council in 2018 and were successful. And so we began the study in 2019. And it was led by my colleague Ben Matthews from Queensland University of Technology and a group of 10 chief investigators, including David Finkelhor. He was one of our team. I'll go through this fairly quickly because many of you have probably seen some of the statistics from the ACMS. Apologies for the abbreviation, Australian Child Maltreatment Study. I'll often just refer to it as ACMS. And all of this data is on the ACMS website. So if you go to acms.au, you'll find all of these statistics, and importantly, the journal articles are all available free. You don't have to have a library membership to be able to access them. So what did we do? We did random digit dial surveys of 8,500 Australians aged 16 and over. A significant proportion of them, 3,500 in fact, were young Australians aged 16 to 24. So they're the ones whose childhoods are most recent. And we're interested, firstly, in understanding, do the experiences of child maltreatment impacts start early on, or is it only later in life that we're able to see this? We also wanted to have a really robust understanding of prevalence of child maltreatment in a recent group, so that future prevalence studies using a similar methodology will be able to compare against this group and see, in fact, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, has prevalence of child maltreatment changed at all? But we also had 5,000 older Australians in each of the age deciles, so 25 to 34, we had 1,000, etc., right up to 65 plus, we had 1,000. And the reason for that is we wanted to know, firstly, are prevalence rates different for each of those different age groups? And secondly, are the mental health consequences different across those different age groups? To be clear, I'm going to talk most about the sexual abuse results, but of course, all of our data covers all 5 forms of child maltreatment and their overlaps. And I'll touch on that from time to time, but I'm going to focus mostly on what we found in relation to sexual abuse. But the definition that we were trying to assess through our questions was this. We wanted to understand about both contact and non-contact sexual acts by an adult or a child in a position of power over a victim to obtain sexual gratification when the child either does not have capacity to provide consent or has capacity but does not provide that consent. So that's based on, an overview of other definitions within the research around child sexual abuse. So that was the definition we were going for. We had 3 questions that we asked that related to contact abuse. So we asked about, had you ever experienced someone touching your private parts, someone attempting to force you to have sex, and then someone actually forcing you to have sex. We also asked one non-contact sexual abuse question around looking at private parts. We also asked some questions around sexual harassment, which is not necessarily about sexual gratification, not necessarily about power, but about doing something intimidating or offensive of a sexual nature. And we did not end up including that data within our prevalence estimate. I am going to be talking about some of the analysis, though, that we have done subsequently on that. And those 5 questions, 4 of which went into our prevalence estimate of child sexual abuse, were asked of the entire population. But we also asked just of the young Australian group, the 16 to 24s, about their experience of non-consensual sharing of sexual images and online grooming by adults. So those 2 internet-related questions, fairly logically, we didn't ask of our 65 pluses about their childhood experiences when the internet did not exist. So shockingly, this is what we found. Here's the rates of each of the 5 forms of child abuse and neglect. And you can see there sexual abuse was experienced by 28.5% of the population. So only slightly higher than what I was finding back 30 years ago in my first year psychology sample of young women. And we can see here that when we break it down, you can see that the rates for contact abuse was 23.7% of the population, and for non-contact sexual abuse was 18.1%. Both of those things add, of course, to more than 28.5%, and that's because the typical experience of child sexual abuse was not 1 event, but in fact 3.5. That was the average. So sometimes people had both a non-contact and a non-contact, a contact and a non-contact, or could have had 2 contacts or 3 contacts or more. And you can see for the contact, breaking it down by each of the 3 questions. Touching was 18.9%, attempted forced sex was 13.8%, and forced sex was 8.7%. So think about that. 8.7% of the population have experienced forced sex during their childhood or adolescence. But it was not evenly distributed. Girls experienced substantially more child sexual abuse in almost all settings. The one where it was different was institutions. That was the setting where boys were more likely to experience sexual abuse than girls. But in every other group of offenders, so we asked the person, did this ever happen to you? So they were behaviourally specific questions. We didn't say, are you a victim survivor of child sexual abuse? We said, did this ever happen to you? And if they said yes, we then asked a number of questions around who it was that did this to you. And this is the answer to their questions that allowed us to group it into, was it a familial offender? Was it non-familial? Was it someone known? Was it someone who was a child or a young person? Was it an adult? Since the original data from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study was reported in the Medical Journal of Australia in April of last year, we've continued to go on to do a number of different analyses, looking more deeply at some of the data and looking also at some of the data that was not analysed in those key journal articles in the special edition of the MJA. So this is one of those, led by myself. And we were looking at the prevalence of people with gender diversity and sexuality diversity. So this was the answer to our demographic question when we asked participants. So remember, it's a telephone interview. An interviewer live is asking, how do you identify your gender? So someone could say, I identify as a male, or identify as a man. They could say, I identify as a female or a woman, or they could give a whole range of other responses. So they could say trans, they could say non-binary, they could say gender diverse. They had a whole range of different, they could say whatever they wanted, and then we grouped them into a number of different categories. They were relatively small. So what we found was that 0.9%, so just under 1% of Australians did not choose male or female. And so we've just grouped everybody who did not choose male or female into a category for the purposes of this analysis. Sorry, and I should also say that the group who did not identify as male or female was even greater for the young Australians. So for the 3,500 who we had who were aged 16 to 24, they were much, much, much more likely than their older counterparts to not identify as male or female. So it was 2.3% of the 16 to 24-year-olds, whereas for the entire sample, it was 0.9%. So firstly, young people are much more likely than older people to identify in a way other than male or female. But really, really importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, they were much more likely to report any form of child maltreatment, but particularly child sexual abuse. So a whopping 81.5% experienced child maltreatment compared to 65% of women and 58% of men. So those figures of 65 and 58 is grouping all of those 5 individual child maltreatment types together, but noting that often people experience more than one kind. And I'll talk a little bit more about multi-type maltreatment in a moment. So what we found was that that pattern not only of youths being more likely to not identify as male or female, they were similarly more likely, if they did not identify as male or female, to have experienced child maltreatment. So it's now over 90% of young gender diverse Australians who have experienced child maltreatment. And we found a similar diversity story in relation to sexual identity. So similarly, we asked a demographic question at the end of the survey around how would you describe your sexuality or your sexual orientation. And anybody who did not say heterosexual or straight, we've grouped them together. Overall, it was just under 10%, so 9.5% overall. But in fact, it was almost 18% of the 16 to 24-year-olds who didn't identify as heterosexual or straight. And exactly the same as what we found with gender diverse Australians was that a substantially higher proportion of those who identify as sexuality diverse have experienced child maltreatment, 83.9%. And of those young people who, as I said, were more likely to not identify as heterosexual, their likelihood of having experienced child maltreatment is even higher. So we're seeing this really strong relationship between diversity and the likelihood of having experienced maltreatment. And so we need to be thinking how we include that in both our prevention and our response strategies. So thinking about parenting skills, thinking about organisational safeguarding, and also thinking about providing redress and providing therapeutic support. How do we recognise the greater likelihood that we're going to be coming across people who do not identify as heterosexual or straight and do not identify as male or female? So this is just a bit of a deep dive. I was talking about any type of child maltreatment. This is talking now specifically about child sexual abuse. Those who identify with a diverse gender, over half experienced sexual abuse. compared to 37% of women and 18.8% of men. So very stark. And then the same thing for sexually diverse identities. And apologies for the error. It's not diverse gender, it's diverse sexualities is over half, and 26.8 percent of those who identify as heterosexual or straight. So what we're seeing is roughly twice the likelihood of those two diversity groups having experienced sexual abuse in particular. I mentioned before that I would come back to this finding about multi-type maltreatment, because if you look at each of those 5 prevalence rates that I began showing you at the beginning, if you add them all together, they come to well over 100%. And the reason is that many people have experienced more than one kind. So across all of the population, what we found was that 62% of Australians have experienced one or more different kinds of maltreatment. As I said, females were more likely than males to experience any type of maltreatment. But here's where we break it down and look at the overlap. So multi-type maltreatment, as I told you at the beginning, this is kind of where my journey in research in this space began, trying to understand this issue of overlap. And what we found, surprisingly, was that multi-type maltreatment was actually the most typical experience. So almost 2 in 5 Australians have experienced 2 or more different forms. That group is bigger than the group who'd experienced no maltreatment, and substantially bigger, in fact, almost double the size of those who'd experienced just one type of maltreatment on its own and no other. And looking at the more severe end of the spectrum, those who'd experienced 3, 4, or 5 different types of maltreatment, it's getting close to 1 in 4 Australians who've experienced this. This slide kind of shows those patterns of overlap. So you can see at the outer edges, those who've experienced one type of maltreatment on its own. So up at the top left is emotional abuse on its own, experienced by 2.6% of the population. Sexual abuse on its own, experienced by 6.7% of the population. Physical abuse on its own, 4.8%. Exposure to domestic violence on its own, 8.4%. And then as you go into the middle, you can see the overlapping groups. And right at the centre is the 3.5% of Australians who've experienced all 5 types of child maltreatment. One of the things that really stands out when you look at this is that in the top 5 most prevalent combinations, exposure to domestic violence was present in them all. So even if you're trying to think about how do we both prevent, identify, and respond to child sexual abuse, understanding exposure to domestic violence is still an important part of the picture because of how often it co-occurs with every other form of child maltreatment, including child sexual abuse. I mentioned before that one of the things that we have focused on with our analysis is the answer to the question for those who had experienced child sexual abuse was, who was it who did this? And so this is the breakdown analysing the answers to that question. And these percentages is not a percentage of those who'd experienced sexual abuse. This is a percentage of the population who'd experienced sexual abuse at the hands of this particular group. So 7.8% of the population have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a parent or an adult caregiver, 7.5% by a known adult, 4.9% by an unknown adult, and 2% by an institutional caregiver. But on the right-hand side, I think are 2 very important statistics, and that's 12.9% who'd experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a known adolescent, 1.4% at the hands of an unknown adolescent. Very quickly, what we see for the youth sample interestingly, is a small drop in the prevalence of child sexual abuse. And this is consistent with, as I said, some of that international research that people like David Finkelhor have been conducting. So a slight drop instead of 28.5%, which was the rate overall for all of our participants, looking just at the 16 to 24-year-olds, it's slightly lower, 25.7%. So a good news story in many ways. However, there's a little bit of an underbelly, if you like, to this story. So let's have a look. The two areas of child sexual abuse that in fact have increased is sexual abuse at the hands of other adolescents, particularly current and former boyfriends. So you can see here for the entire sample, 11% experienced sexual abuse at the hands of an adolescent who they knew but wasn't a current or a former romantic partner. But it's gone up to 13.7% for our 16 to 24-year-olds. And when we break it down by gender, the rate for our young Australian women is double that for men. And then even more starkly, do we see sexual abuse, the increase in sexual abuse at the hands of another adolescent who was a current or former romantic partner. So it's gone up from 2.5%
think so.
entire sample
Mm.
to 5.7% of the youth sample. So doubling in rate over time. But you can then see the gender breakdown, that it's around about 5 times the likelihood that young Australian women are experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of a current or a former romantic partner compared to young Australian males. One of my PhD students, Gabby Hunt, has led this analysis of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, and it is focused in particular on the participants who, when they asked who it was that did this, said that it was a religious adult, a religious leader or an adult in a religious organisation. So it could have been, a priest or a minister, a bishop, a lay leader, or somebody involved with, church ministry. It could have been a Sunday school teacher, a youth group leader, etc. And what we found was that 0.4%, which equates to 1 in 250 Australians, have experienced child sexual abuse at the hands of a leader or an adult in a religious organisation. But the rate is significantly higher for men, 0.8%, compared to women, 0.1%. We also have seen really substantial declines, which is a good news story. So it's about 10 times less likely that the current group of young Australians have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a religious leader or adult compared to the 65 plus. And noting that in the 65 plus, it's predominantly men who have experienced this form of abuse. We also, when they said it was a religious organisation or leader, we asked which denomination it was. Sometimes they volunteered that, but if they didn't, we would ask. And then we grouped the answers into these broad groupings. So 71.9% of those who'd experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a religious leader or an adult experienced it within a Catholic church or organisation. 21.8% experienced it in other Christian denominations, including Anglican churches and Anglican organisations. 5.1% in other religions, so non-Christian religions, and 1.2% did not say which denomination it was. Sorry, I should say before moving on, while it's pleasing that it's a relatively low rate compared to other forms of child sexual abuse, particularly at the hands of other known adults, be they parents, caregivers, or other adults who are known to children, and particularly in relation to sexual abuse at the hands of an adolescent, it still represents a substantial number. So approximately 85,000 Australians. If we extrapolate our numbers from our representative sample to the number of the Australian population, we estimate that there would be around about 85,000 Australians who have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a religious leader or other adult. So those details are in this paper, which, as I said, are all available on the ACMS website, and you can download and read the statistics in more detail. I also mentioned that my student Gabby Hunt has also analysed the data that we did not include in that prevalence estimate of 28.5% of the Australian population have experienced child sexual abuse. So she was looking at this data on sexual harassment, but only looking at sexual harassment at the hands of peers. So we've excluded data that was sexual harassment by an adult towards a child or a young person. So this is just peer-to-peer sexual harassment. What she found was that across all ages, 10% experienced peer sexual harassment. But just as we saw with child sexual abuse, and in fact, regardless of whether it was the youth sample or across the entire population, we're seeing the same thing here in relation to child sexual abuse. That's a very gendered story. The proportion of men who'd experienced peer sexual harassment was half that of the average rate. So in fact, 1/3 of the rate for women. So 5% of men, 15.3% of women, and almost 1 in 4, 24% of people who identify with a diverse gender. Where are they experiencing this peer sexual harassment from? Whether the person engaging in the harassment was a male or female, we asked them, and in fact, the majority of those who'd experienced peer sexual harassment was experiencing it from a male. The real exception to this is 8% of people who identify with a diverse gender experience peer sexual harassment from a female. So that's probably the slight divergence from what is otherwise a very gendered story of women being much more likely to experience it, people with diverse genders being even more likely to have experienced it, and most often that is coming at the hands of of a male. So I think we have a very gendered story, both in terms of victimization and in terms of perpetration of this form of harm. When we break down by sexual orientation of the Australian population, we can see a very similar story, again, to what we saw with child sexual abuse, that heterosexual men were much less likely to have experienced peer sexual harassment, less likely than women who are heterosexual, and less likely than people with diverse genders who identify as heterosexual. But then as we go through the other sexuality categories, we can see that the proportion who've experienced peer sexual harassment is substantially higher. Even for, when we get to categories like women who are bisexual being much more likely to have experienced peer sexual harassment than men who are bisexual and men who are gay or lesbian. So to wrap up our work on peer sexual harassment, Gabby Hunt's analysis shows that male peers are the most common group to have inflicted it, that it likely occurs at or in the hands of or in the context of relationships based on attendance at school, and it can very easily be normalized, tolerated, or downplayed. So we have to think about what we can do to address this. And we know from other research that really rigorous and long-term community-based advocacy programs that aim at shifting harmful gender attitudes are really important. And of course, I think churches and church-related organisations play a really important part in this. We also need school-based interventions aimed at addressing sexual violence and cultural norms around gender in relationships. And it's likely that this contributes to both peer sexual harassment and peer sexual abuse that I've already presented on before. I haven't got time to go through in detail all of the presentations, but you can see on this slide that we have a wealth of downloadable infographics that summarize some of the key findings. They're very easy to download and share with clergy at your church, with your leadership teams, with colleagues, wherever you might be working. You're very welcome to download these and to share them. So I want to spend the last few minutes, and I better just keep an eye on the time to see how I'm going. I've got about 15 minutes, but I do want to leave a bit of time for question. I just want to now turn about what does prevention look like? And again, taking a bit of a historical look and see what's changed and what needs to change. So as I said at the beginning, one of the things we've already seen is that we're moving away from this default position that we had many decades ago around the primary source of danger being strangers. And there's a link there about some work that I'd written about that suggests what we should be telling to parents is don't teach your kids about stranger danger or tricky people. Try talking about some of these other strategies. And you can go to that link and read what I actually say. But why do we want to suggest that we move away from just talking about stranger danger? Well, firstly, sometimes child abusers, it's tricky to recognise them as tricky. Why? Because of our increasing scholarship and understanding of grooming behaviours. That people who are perpetrating child sexual abuse do a lot to build up trust with a child or young person, with the organisation that they might be part of, with their family, with their community. They can be charming and respected. And so it's much easier in hindsight to be able to differentiate between grooming and people who are trustworthy and wholesome. So in fact, this has turned our attention to thinking about, well, if we can't always identify in advance who is a tricky person, can we try and make environments safer so that regardless of whether a person is tricky or not, regardless of whether a person has an intention to commit harm to a child, that they're less likely to be able to do it and less likely to be able to get away. And our reason for doing that is that in order for child sexual abuse to occur, many authors have talked about the importance of these kind of three things needing to come together. You have to have a person who's motivated to offend, a person who has a level of vulnerability, so who could be a potential victim, and then opportunity. In other words, for those things to occur, there has to be the capacity for that motivated offender to, in fact, be able to break down the natural inhibitions that a child or a young person may have in order to be able to offend. It's really hard to know about the intentions of an offender. It's also hard and stigmatizing to focus just on the vulnerability of individuals. What we can do, though, is widespread rollout of opportunity reduction. And of course, child safe standards and many of the activities of the national principles for child safe organisations are focused on opportunity reduction. But I think even greater effort needs to be placed on that. In preparing for this presentation, I went back on my bookshelf behind me here and looked at some of the books that I'd acquired early on in my career. And this one was one of the first ones that I'd bought. It was that was published in 1990. And there's one short chapter in it about prevention. Mostly it's about understanding the signs, understanding the impacts, all of that kind of stuff. But there's one short chapter on prevention. And I thought, oh, what would they have to say about that? And it's quite amazing that not much has really changed since then. This is what they said, that we need to be intervening with potential perpetrators early in their lives in order to be able to stop them from engaging in harmful behaviours. So in other words, we have to not just focus on secondary and tertiary prevention with high-risk populations after harm has occurred, but in fact, trying to stop abuse from happening in the first place. And to do that, Con in 1990 said we need to be doing these things. I haven't got time to talk about them all, but teaching about healthy sexuality, teaching about how to identify abuse, but also screen out those who are unsuitable, to provide prevention education for children themselves and for their parents, to have child-safe processes in organisations in order to make organisations themselves safer, i.e. that opportunity reduction. We need to be educating the public, having public health messages, and we also need to be treating perpetrators to stop the likelihood that they will be harming others into the future. This was back in 1990. So, what's been shifting since then? Well, in the 2000s, we saw some shifts from what we called protective behaviours programs to a broader understanding of what we call child sexual abuse prevention education. So teaching not just about reaching out and saying no when someone feels icky, but in fact, more broadly around the importance of body safety, respect, and consent. We've also had a number of strategies that are focused on perpetrators. So we've got our working with children check processes, our suitability assessments, and reportable conduct screens. And in fact, some of the earliest work that I did as a researcher, again, shortly after my first publication that I presented at that conference, was an evaluation that I did with colleagues from Deakin University of a sexual assault prevention program that was being done in schools to try and teach these kind of, body safety rules and what to do when you feel unsafe. So we've shifted now and trying to not focus just on bad people, but focusing on other things. And the reason for that, if we just focus on individuals and try to screen them out, so not have them in our organisations, the problem with that is, of course, first-time abusers have no offence history that would allow them to be screened out. Much abuse goes undetected or unreported, so we wouldn't be detecting them in any screening process. We also know that children and young people can engage in harm just the same way that adults can, and they are not part of any working with children check screening process. So if we can't always screen out unsuitable adults, what else can we do? We have to focus on what we call the power of the situation to influence individual behaviour. So what can we do to actually drive change to the environments in which children are, existing and living and growing? So these are some of the directions, as I've already said, having more comprehensive prevention education, having parent-led and parent-focused interventions to complement that, addressing sexual socialization, particularly toxic kind of masculinity, interventions focused on perpetrators or potential perpetrators to provide help and to remediate harm. Child-safe principles for all youth-serving organisations, but two in particular that I'm now going to very quickly cover: situational crime prevention and contextual prevention. So what do we mean by contextual prevention? So this work was led by colleagues of mine from the University of the Sunshine Coast in partnership with my team at the Institute of Child Protection Studies here at ACU. And we created the first definition of what we mean by contextual prevention. And you can see on the slide here, it's about child sexual abuse efforts that target factors external to the individual. And they could be at the macro level and micro level structures to try and create safe environments for children and young people. What does that actually mean? So it's a range of different things. So it could be about addressing social determinants, so that could be things like poverty, it could be about alcohol availability, or more directly related things such as access to porn, and in particular, very harmful porn. It could be about online access to social networks that have attitudes towards women and girls that are harmful. Enhancing formal regulatory controls and examples of that we're seeing debates about at the moment, including banning young people from accessing social media. I've got to put it out there that I think providing education to equip them so that when they turn 18 or when they turn 16, they're not suddenly thrown into a world that they haven't been prepared for, is probably a better answer than a blanket ban. But that's more complex to deliver, I think. And crime prevention through environmental design. So a simple example of this is things like in schools where we've had a long focus around encouraging there to be line of sight to where children might be. So there'll be a glass panel in a door so that when an adult is spending time alone with a child, it could be for an individual music lesson, it could be a school counselor, it could be, a principal having a disciplinary discussion with a child or a young person, or it could be a classroom itself, that other people going by can see who is there and what's going on. And then more broadly, situational crime prevention. So trying to understand where risks in the environment might be. So I'll just give some examples of where the process that can be done to go about doing this. So what we've said in that paper was we need to, first of all, select a target. Now, the way you might go about doing that is firstly to ask young people themselves around where they might feel unsafe. So if it was in a school context, they might say about a particular part of the playground, or they might say it's in the art room or in, the drama rehearsal room. So select a target, then assess what are the risks within that setting. What is it that makes them feel uncomfortable? And then matching that to prevention strategies. So it could be a simple thing like increasing line of sight, such as putting in a glass panel. It could be about increasing supervision. It could be about having, if it's the risk is, let's say, transport to a sports, event. It could be about having, multiple children being driven by the adult. It could be having check-in processes to check in on their safety and how they're feeling before and afterwards. Then it's about implementing that prevention strategy and then in an ongoing way assessing whether in fact there is still a risk, whether young people still feel safe, whether adults still see a risk, whether parents still see a risk. And it's a cyclical thing. So pick one strategy, work on it. It's actually quite simple and is an iterative thing that all organisations, I believe, should have as part of their ongoing kind of prevention-oriented, safeguarding strategies. So here's just a couple of examples. A colleague of mine, Keith Kaufman, has been doing this with sports organisations, and he's identified a really simple four-step process. Firstly, brainstorming, and it can be done separately with each of the different groups of children and young people themselves, adults within the organisation, parents or broader community. Prioritising solutions, so recognising or prioritising first the risk, because knowing that you can't necessarily work on everything all at once, which is the one that you're going to focus on first. Develop some solutions, things that are going to either prevent the risk from being a problem or will mitigate the risk. Sometimes you can't get rid of the risk entirely, but you can try and mitigate it through having alternate strategies and then implementing those. And again, my colleague, Carleen Furman in the UK, has focused on this, particularly in community settings. So, it could be public spaces like, town squares or shopping centres, a range of different places. And here's some tools that we've developed to assist with this. So these are free, they're available to be downloaded, and you can access them through the web link that I have there. So wrapping up towards the end of my presentation, just to reiterate that I think we have to keep our child sexual abuse prevention strategies focused equally on these 3 Ps, about people, about places, and about our processes. So finally, where do we go to from here? Well, we know that many people, myself included, are calling for what we call a public health approach to prevention. So that means focusing on the right issues. So making sure we're looking at what the research has shown to be risk factors, those ones that are occurring right across the population, but ones that are amenable to change. And moving then to interventions that address those risk factors right across the population. When's the best time to do it? Obviously earlier. Earliest is even better. It's kind of like planting a tree. Doing it 10 years ago is the best time. So let's get on to it. But we also have to make sure that we're using strategies that work. So looking at the evidence base around effective interventions, but also understanding that the best place to deliver those are not necessarily organisations like statutory child protection authorities, who often are very stigmatised in terms of the access that parents and families might have to their services. And so community agencies, including church and welfare agencies and particularly ones like early childhood settings and schools. And of course, we know that many church-related organisations provide education and care right across the community, that they're often the best sites for bringing about change, including evidence-based parenting programs. And I think that even in child sexual abuse prevention, it's really important to build capacity of parents to be able to do that child sexual abuse prevention education work at home, and to build their skills in being able to have what we call courageous conversations with children and young people around what might be making them feel unsure, or scared, or icky. And parents need to be feeling comfortable to talk about sex and sexuality, because you can't have a child sexual abuse disclosure. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say you can't. You're unlikely to if you haven't already built the groundwork to have free and open conversations with children and young people. We can't expect that they're going to make a disclosure if we haven't already set that groundwork. So my colleague Douglas Russell and I have been kind of thinking about these 3 Ps of prevention and thinking, well, how does that work from an organisational perspective? And we see these kind of 6 key themes as a good way of summing up many of the findings from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, that these are the kind of 6 key enabling capabilities that organisations need to have, and strategies that they need to prevent in order to keep children safe and respond when children feel unsafe or when harm occurs. So this is final slide, I think. Where do we go to from here? I think we need some increased education and awareness, particularly with parents. We need to be focusing on digital safety. As technology advances, there's going to be a greater emphasis on digital literacy and online safety. So we need to be focusing around how we can be both recognising and reporting grooming behaviours, including those ones that occur on digital spaces. And that means engaging with new technologies, including things like online gaming. So young people who are playing video games where there's messaging capability and interaction with other people, how do we ensure safety for them? How do we build the skills of parents to know how to support them and play a preventative role? We can also think about AI and how we can use technology in the future to be able to identify patterns that could suggest potential risk and proactively protect children. But really importantly, and this is really the culmination of my lifetime's work, is about integrating with prevention of other forms of child maltreatment. That we need more holistic education, knowing how often child sexual abuse occurs within the context of other forms of abuse and neglect. How can we kind of lean in and wrap up together many of our strategies around supporting parents to create safe, non-violent environments for their children. So to learn those kind of parenting skills that are really important. So there's lots of references here that I'm more than happy for you to follow up with, but that's it for my presentation. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, Alison, but more than happy to kind of take questions or comments from the floor.
No, I don't think anyone will be concerned that you're taking a little bit longer. It was certainly very engaging and